Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. This is Josh Sharfstein. Today, the Ohio train derailment. I speak to Johns Hopkins professor Tom Burke, who previously led environmental efforts for the state of New Jersey and served as the chief scientist at the Environmental Protection Agency. We talk about the risks to residents, the knowns, the unknowns, and where to go from here. Let's listen. Dr. Tom Burke, thank you so much for joining me on Public Health on Call to talk about this terrible situation in Ohio. It started with a train wreck.
It sure did. And like most train wrecks, as you know, as a health official, things happen on Friday nights, right? And so late at night on a Friday, there was a wreck and there was a delay in reporting. And unfortunately, more than 20 cars of hazardous material were involved in a release and ultimately a major fire in East Palestine, Ohio.
Let's start with what we know about the actual hazards. What kind of chemicals were aboard?
Well, from what we know, there were hazardous chemicals involved in some of these cars that derailed. Probably the most notorious is vinyl chloride, which is part of plastics manufacturing, or we all know polyvinyl chloride and PVC pipes and other things and things for our house. But the monomer is a gas that was contained in 5 of these cars, and it's very hazardous. It's acutely hazardous when there's a kind of immediate or acute exposure, and it causes real serious irritation. But perhaps longer term, what is worrisome, if it sticks around, it's been known to cause cancers in workers at high exposure, and so it is a carcinogen.
Now, there are reports that there were clouds of chemicals, that people were experiencing side effects right there, potentially of the release. Is this kind of exposure plausibly linked to those kinds of symptoms?
The chemicals that have been, there have been a number of other toxic chemicals that were also identified as cargo on the derailed cars, and they are irritants. Definitely. So it has been linked to the kinds of things that people have reported: eye irritation, throat irritation, nausea. And don't forget smoke itself. And there was incredibly thick smoke, and big particles in the air from the burning can be very irritating.
So you've got this immediate hazard, and then you've got the fear because of what you said about vinyl chloride and some of the long-term potential effects of other chemicals, that this could be a health exposure that takes some time to really take shape.
Yes. And that's kind of the 2 phases of these kind of emergencies. There's the acute emergency and making sure people get out of the way. Even before we know, we evacuate, or we tell people to shelter in place to avoid exposure. But then the really difficult decisions are, when is it safe to go back home? Particularly when the environmental monitoring has been just preliminary and geared toward the more acute exposure. So there's lots more that we need to know to rebuild the trust of people there and to assure that the exposures have been eliminated and the health hazards have been reduced.
You mentioned trust because in parallel to the actual health concerns that have been raised, there are all kinds of concerns about trust that are coming up. Where are those coming from as you hear this story?
Well, absolutely, probably. And Josh, you and I, as officials, have both been involved in issues that people have been upset about. And here is, in the middle of the night in this idyllic community, a train wreck changes everything. And people are pulled from their homes with great uncertainty. So they lost trust in the railroad, and the railroad has a major responsibility for decision-making there. They lost trust to some degree in their local and state officials. And they're questioning whether the federal officials in charge of the safety of the railroad and even the EPA are the right people to believe in this. And so trust, whether it's a train wreck or other environmental hazards, has always been a real challenge for public health officials.
So what we know is that there have been some briefings of the residents, but we get the sense that not everyone is participating. I guess the train officials have decided not to participate. But also, there are questions that people have that maybe haven't been answered that well.
There's lots of questions that need to be answered. And you can even think it, as a dad and a family member or as a healthcare provider, you have to be concerned about the most vulnerable people in your community, the kids, the asthmatic senior citizens, the most vulnerable. And what might seem as though it's okay to go home, well, if there are lingering odors there, that could be very, very troubling and cause health effects in vulnerable populations. So really, the kind of monitoring that's been done has been that acute emergency monitoring to say, well, we don't have high exposures, but we really need now is to communicate to folks that there's a stepwise process and everything possible is being done to assure that we have measured that there's no more continuing exposures, and we can provide them information that gives them the basic comfort level to go back to their homes.
If they can, if that kind of data shows that.
If they can. And, there's still unknowns because if you think, imagine a big explosion and then they burn off tank cars full of a very hazardous material. It burns for days. We're talking days with lots of things to suppress the fire poured on there that have gotten into local streams and now the Ohio River and put downstream effects and smoke that may have impacted agricultural areas, fish kills. There's lots of questions. And so the most important thing, and I know it's tough in a big open public meeting like they had last night at the town, but you got to listen first and really understand what people need to know to regain their confidence in their community and their trust in local leaders.
And so, just saying, great news, the acute phase doesn't seem to be continuing. That's not particularly appreciated when people are really thinking about all the implications for their lives.
Absolutely. And I think even most scientists would say there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And so sometimes it's really worth it to take things a little bit slower, to listen and to be as reassuring as possible and use the best science possible. What the heck going on there? How does the indoor air in the schools and the homes measure up? And how do we go about airing out our homes and our schools and really getting back to everyday life?
Let me ask you that. It is possible to provide data on where things are right now that is pretty good. But as you point out, there are all kinds of questions for which there may not be good answers right now.
Right.
And getting those answers should be a very high priority, but will take time. So how do you handle that? For a community that has had this awful exposure, there's a lot of concern. Nobody wants to hear 5 years from now that there's been an unacceptable risk for 5 years.
Right.
How do you decide whether to move people out? How do you decide whether the risk is too much while we're waiting for more information?
Well, it's a progression, and it's a stepwise process. First things first, you got to characterize what was there. What's in the soil at the site? What's in the groundwater? What's in the drinking water? What do you know about the air in the site? To make sure you don't have a continuing source, that's a problem. And then you work your way back, and you have to really understand, well, what do we know about homes? And should we do a thorough testing or should we go in there with ventilation? Sometimes getting in there, one of the things, I don't know, Josh, if you've ever been in a fire, the fire department has come to a home near you. When they put the fire out, they get the exhaust fans going right away, and they're really well equipped to reduce those smoke impacts and things like that. And sometimes good basic public health to clear the air, to make sure the water is safe, if appropriate, to test the water, but also to provide water filtration for folks or alternative water. In this case, they are providing bottled water so that you can do the longer term measurements and make sure that things are not going to cause any further harm and that people can be reassured.
So partly what you're saying, Dr. Burke, is that yes, it may take a while to get those big answers, like how much risk total is there, but even in the relatively short term, there can be a number of tests done that point in one direction or another. And if the evidence is trending in a bad direction, well, that may lead people in the government to take more extreme action. If it's trending in a better direction as they test these different sources of exposure, then that may prove to be more reassuring. But the important thing is that they are very active right now collecting data to answer some of the questions that people justifiably have.
Absolutely.
Now, have you in your career been involved in train wrecks with toxic exposures?
Josh, as you know, I was both a federal and a state official for a long time. And I have to say, train wrecks, and particularly, I was deputy health commissioner in New Jersey in charge of environment, and train wrecks and transportation accidents are unfortunately common. And they are one thing that I honestly say kept me up at night, because we move a lot of hazardous material through neighborhoods. And it is a weak link in our national infrastructure for moving things around, whether it be crude oil and concerns about major fires from crude oil trains, or whether it be hazardous chemicals. So I have been involved, I have responded, but I also feel things have worked out pretty well. If you have a good response and you can provide the right kind of data for decision making, you can move ahead.
We had a train wreck here in Baltimore not too long ago.
It seems like just yesterday, but I remember hearing the air raid sirens go off in the city of Baltimore. And this was just before 9/11 in July of 2001. And it was a really unusual event. And we had a major train wreck in the Howard Street tunnel under the city that involved more than 50 cars of burning material, mostly lumber and less hazardous things, but there were some hazardous chemicals. But the city was filled with smoke. It literally shut down downtown, canceled 3 Orioles games. But I think the city and the city health department and the state folks responded very well to that hazard, and we were able to have a good response. And it was a lengthy recovery because it was a fire in a tunnel. There was a major water main break downtown, but people generally understood that we're all working together to prevent and prevent these things in the future and respond. And even the Baltimore Orioles had to make sacrifices, and we lost 3 games that year to the schedule.
Maybe I think that it was so recent because I think some of the litigation has continued until pretty recently.
It has, and it pointed to the weaknesses in our infrastructure and for rail safety and for transportation in general. But I think, sadly, most industrialized states have had to deal with this, and many, many communities throughout the country have had to deal with it.
It raises the question of whether there should be changes for rail safety. Do you think that there's an agenda that could make transportation safer?
Well, I sure hope so. I think we're making unprecedented investments in infrastructure right now, in our transportation infrastructure as well as our drinking water infrastructure. And I would hope that this is definitely raising the red flag that we have to pay attention to rail safety, as we have such an important dependence on our supply chain and so many vulnerabilities. So as we see the rebuilding of our rail infrastructure, hopefully we also see increased responsibility for the railroads and for the companies responsible for the manufacture and use of these compounds to make sure safety is job one.
So that brings up the role of the companies. And this is my last question for you, but it's a tricky one, which is when you have a disaster like this, it is very understandable and natural to know, for people to ask, who should we blame? Who is responsible?
I can tell you from my own personal experience, in the middle of an emergency, I really tried to put blame on the back burner, understanding that there had to be accountability for this. There had to be movement toward prevention to understand who's responsible. But as you are out there trying to protect public health, I think people get angry and they blame lots of folks. Sometimes they blame the government. They blame the Environmental Protection Agency for not doing a better job to respond. And there's lots of blame to go around. But I think what's most important is that we understand our most important job is to protect our communities. Blame will sort itself out. And hopefully by understanding responsibilities, having more oversight for accountability will lead to prevention. We can make some progress.
So in part of the message is it's going to be appropriate to blame people. We will get there. That will happen. But right now we have to roll up our sleeves and figure out what the hazards are and what can be done to protect people from them.
There is a time to sort out blame. There's a time to recover costs and make sure that there's accountability. But right now, I think the responsibility of everyone, whether it be in this case Norfolk Southern, the railroad, or the many, many agencies involved, they should be really focused on the health of the community, understanding that, and working to address their questions and return them to the security of their community.
Dr. Burke, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Josh.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.